Hello students, welcome to BBA 432 International Business Management Part 2. In Part 2 of Chapter 6, we will be covering international trade and factor mobility theories. Continuing our discussion with the PLC theory, which is the learning objective 4, the product life cycle theory, in an effort to explain why a country's export capabilities are dynamic. So as you can see, compared to the previous theories that we reviewed, the absolute advantage and the comparative advantage, the product life cycle theory, PLC, is a more dynamic theory, more focusing on explaining the differences in the export capabilities of the countries. So basically, the product life cycle theory of trade argues that the production location of certain manufactured products shifts as they go through their life cycle. So every product, and indeed every firm, has a product life cycle. The cycle basically consists of 4 stages: introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. So the introduction stage is marked by initially all the developments taking place within the firm. So it will be marked by innovation in response to an observed need, exporting by the innovative country, and evolving product characteristics. In the second stage, which is growth, growth is characterized by increases in exports by the innovating country, more competition in the marketplace as the countries or the firms face rivalry from other countries or competitors, right? So during this stage, the firms increase the capital intensity. Okay, so you will be a growth in capital intensity, and also some foreign production taking place elsewhere. Okay, so the companies, in other words, either make direct investments in other countries, or they began expanding their operations globally. Okay. The third stage is the maturity stage. The maturity is characterized by a decline in exports from the innovating country. Previously, in the introduction and the growth stage, the innovating country, for instance, such as the United States, was the leader in exporting, right? So the economic development in the growth stage was characterized by increases in exports in the innovating or by the innovating country. Whereas in the maturity stage, you will see a decline in exports from the innovating country. So we see more product standardization as the products become more and more standardized and less differentiated. We see more capital intensity and also increased competitiveness of price, as well as the production starts up in emerging economies. So the rivals at this point are not only the rivals in advanced industrialized countries, but the rivals starting to emerge in the late developing countries or emerging economies. The last stage is the decline stage. Decline is characterized by a concentration of production in developing countries. So at this point, the advanced industrialized country faces a competition from the developing countries as the production moves overseas, as the production moves to developing countries, either in the form of outsourcing or in the form of investments in developing countries. And at this point, an innovating country becomes a net importer as the exports decline and imports increase. So other countries, in other words, developing countries, start producing locally and begin to export to the innovating country. So at this point, the production moves overseas. The production now most frequently takes place in the emerging economy. Emerging economy firms begin to invest in their own countries, export their goods to the innovating country. So at this point, an innovative country becomes a net importer. It was running a trade surplus before, but now it becomes a net importer and probably running a trade deficit as opposed to trade surplus. Okay? So there are, of course, some exceptions to the product life cycle theory, right? And the number one problem in the assumption is that not all countries or not all firms go through these stages, right? Some types of products abound for which production locations usually do not shift. There are some exceptions to the product life cycle theory. For example, there are products with high transportation costs. Those are the non-tradable goods. Those goods may have to be produced close to the market, thus never becoming significant exports really. So product life cycle theory rely on the assumption of exporting, but some goods and services cannot be exported because they are non-tradable goods, right? So there are products that, because of very rapid innovation, have also extremely short life cycles, therefore making it impossible to reduce costs by moving production from one country to another. For instance, some fashion items, especially fast fashion items, generally fit in this category. The fast fashion items that Zara, H&M produce generally fit in this category. They have very, very extremely short life cycles. Therefore, they do not typically go through the four life cycle that a typical product goes through. So there are also luxury products, right? Luxury products for which cost is of little concern to the consumer. In fact, production in a developing country may cause consumers to perceive the product less luxurious. Okay? And let's continue with the other exceptions to the PLC theory. For instance, products for which a company can use a differentiation strategy, perhaps through advertising or better marketing strategies, to maintain the consumer demand without competing on the basis of price. So again, the product may not necessarily face decline because the firm may decide to invest money in a differentiation strategy that makes its products more and more unique and still maintain the consumer demand through sophisticated advertising or marketing strategies. And also, products that require specialized technical personnel to locate near production so as to continually move the products into their next generation of models, right? So this is another exception to the PLC theory. For instance, this argument seems to explain the long-term US dominance of medical equipment production and also German superiority or German dominance in rotary printing presses, right? So US superiority in medical equipment production, which these products never really faced a decline. They never really faced decline. So the United States have maintained its superiority in these products, whereas you can also see the German dominance and never declined. Germany never really declined in rotary printing presses. Okay, so let's look at the other learning objective, which is all about, again, the country's dynamic export capabilities, right? So we will be looking at the diamond model of national competitive advantage, a theory of competitive advantage in a way, and explaining why some countries are more developed than the others, or why they have created and maintained more competitive economies that gave them the critical edge to beat their rivals, right? So this theory was introduced by the Harvard management professor Michael Porter, who created this model of the national competitive advantage. So basically, according to this theory, the company's development and maintenance of internationally competitive products depends on the following favorable conditions. So we have the factor conditions, the demand conditions, related and supporting industries, and also firm structure, strategy, and rivalry. So these are the four conditions of the diamond model, four conditions that give every country and their firms the ability to compete on an international scale. So in the case of factor conditions, we have the issue, the resources, right? Resources in a country, sufficient quantities and combinations of the quality of labor, capital, raw materials, and also all of these resources should be available at the acceptable prices. And then demand conditions should be necessary, right? Demand conditions pertain to the question, are consumers likely to buy what we can produce with the factor conditions above and at the price we can deliver to them? So it's all about the sufficiency of the demand conditions, meaning the consumer demand in the economy. And then we have the related and supporting industries, which pertain to the question of, can we outsource production of sufficient components and services to allow us to concentrate our efforts on what we can do the best? Okay. And then finally, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry is all about the competitive conditions and the strategies that the firms are using to beat the rival companies in the rival nations, right? So will competitive conditions and our reactions to them enable the firms to evolve our operations to sustain and improve our market position? Okay. So this is very important to understanding and having these necessary four conditions to be globally competitive is very, very important, because this is really the guidance to economic development and economic growth. But the issue is that these conditions are neither static nor purely domestic. So it is wrong to assume that, or it would be simplistic to assume that these conditions only occur in the domestic markets, because they can be acquired. They can also be acquired globally. They may not be purely national or domestic. So remember the opening case study in chapter 6, which is all about Costa Rica's economic transformation. Costa Rica is one of the most developed countries in Central America as well as in Latin America. Right after Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica's economic model development can be seen as a model of sustainable economic development. So you can see in this case study how the Costa Rican government indeed restructured its educational system to tailor the country's human resource development to fit the needs of the targeted industries. For instance, it developed local supplies and attracted sufficient number of foreign firms so that their combined presence assured a vibrant competitive environment and allowed the local economy to develop and prosper and so forth and so on. But that being said, there are some limitations of the competitive advantage theory, right? It's important to be aware of the limitations of the diamond model, okay? So one limitation is that the existence of the four favorable conditions, right? The factor, demand, related and supported industries, and the firm strategy. The existence of the four favorable conditions may be necessary, but not necessarily an insufficient condition for the development of a particular national industry or national competitiveness. Okay, so these all four may be necessary, but not sufficient condition, right? Or it might be an insufficient condition for the development of particular industry. So even when abundant, resources are ultimately limited. Don't forget this. So factor conditions may be abundant, labor, capital, raw materials, but they're still limited. Therefore, the firms will always make choices. They must make choices regarding their pursuit of existing opportunities, because resources are not unlimited. They are scarce, which is a fundamental economic assumption, right? So also, furthermore, given the ability of firms to gain market information and production inputs from abroad, the absence of favorable conditions within a country may be overcome by their existence internationally. Don't forget. In other words, some of these conditions, in other words, can be gained or acquired internationally. They should not have to be necessarily developed or acquired domestically. And why is it sometimes possible to obtain the four conditions internationally? Because the firms are able to. Firms are able to gain market information and access and production of inputs from abroad. Okay? Therefore, these four conditions can be created and acquired internationally. Don't forget that. They don't have to be acquired domestically. And think about other examples. For instance, observations of foreign and foreign plus domestic demand conditions have spurred much of the Asian economic growth, right? In fact, the Japanese companies such as Unidan and Fujitech target their sales almost entirely to foreign markets. They did not really target the domestic markets initially. So therefore, the demand conditions were generated from abroad. So companies and countries do not depend entirely on domestic factor conditions. For example, capital and managers are now internationally mobile, and companies may depend on foreign locations for portions of their production, right? We have outsourcing, we have foreign direct investment, right? If related and supporting industries are not available locally, materials and components are now more easily brought from abroad because of transformation advances and relaxed import restrictions. Okay? In fact, many of the multinational companies nowadays assemble products with parts and raw materials supplied from a variety of countries. So this is the fact of outsourcing. It's just that we outsource raw materials inputs and we even outsource labor, right? So companies react not only to domestic rivals, but also to foreign-based rivals at home and abroad. So there is really no distinction between the global markets and local markets anymore, right? The separation of the local from the global has become obsolete in the world of globalization. Our economy has become very globalized and globally integrated, and therefore the distinction between local or domestic or global has become somewhat obsolete. Okay, so thus the prior domestic absence of any of the four conditions that we just talked about may not necessarily inhibit or undermine the companies. Companies will find ways of satisfying or acquiring those conditions wherever they are available globally. Okay. So, and then if we look at the objective 6.5, now we will be transitioning to the factor mobility theory, right? Summarizing the reasons for and effects of international factor movements. So, over time, factor conditions change in both quality and the quantity. Concomitantly, the mobility of capital, technology, and people, right? So we're really talking about, when we talk about the factor conditions, there are 3-4 variables that we're talking about: the capital, technology, and the people, and their mobility, right? Their ability to move from one region or one country to another country. So therefore, the factor mobility theory here focuses on why production factors move. Why do the production factors move? And the effects of that movement on transforming the factor endowments themselves, and the impact of international factor mobility, especially people, on the world trade. So the factor mobility theory, which focuses on why production factors move, the effects of that movement on transforming the factor endowments, and also the impact of international factor mobility, especially people, right, on world trade. So this is really the main focus of the factor mobility theory, right? So, which is all related to the learning objective 6.5, right? Summarizing the reasons for and the major effects of international factor movements. So if you look at this, each factor, right? The capital, people, if you analyze them one by one, you will see that the capital, especially short-term capital, is the most international and mobile production factor. It is much more flexible and mobile, more mobile than the human capital, people. So the reason this is the case is because companies and the private individuals primarily transfer capital because of the differences in the expected return, which is accounting for the risk factor, right? And that mobility of capital is mainly triggered by the outlooks of economic and the political conditions. However, if you look at the people component, the human capital, in other words, you will see that it is less mobile than capital. Some, of course, people travel to other countries as tourists, students, and retirees. However, this does not affect the factor endowments as such, because these travelers do not work in the destination countries, right? Unlike funds that can be cheaply transferred by wire, people usually must incur high transportation costs to work abroad. So it's much easier to transfer money, right, and the technology through a wire, through a bank transfer, and so forth and so on, whereas we cannot really transfer people, right? People, to be able to work in other countries, they must incur high costs, whether the transportation costs, whether they need to apply for a work permit, they need to apply for an immigration visa, political asylum, that there are different ways of going to other countries, but all of these factors incur high costs. So, a controversial issue is the effect of outward migration on the countries. Just a second, please. So basically here, we're talking about the effect of outward migration on the countries. So on the one hand, countries lose potentially productive resources when their educated people leave, right? And when the educated people migrate to other countries, this is called a brain drain. On the other hand, many of these people are now sending remittances back. So many people, let's say, immigrate from Latin America or the Middle East or Europe to the United States, right, which can be considered as a brain drain. But on the other hand, they keep sending remittances back, which help economic development of those emerging or transitioning or developing economies. For example, remittances account for 29% of Nepal's GDP, right? There is also evidence that the outward movement and the remittances of people leads to an increase in the startup companies and capital and formation of local businesses in the home country, like Nepal, right? So countries receiving productive human resources also incur costs by providing social services and acculturating people to a new language and society, hence the assimilation costs and so forth and so on. Okay? Again, if you look at the relationship between trade and factor mobility, we focus on the issue of substitution and complementarity, right? Which is all about the relationship between foreign trade and international factor mobility. Substitution is all about, when the factor proportions vary widely among the countries, pressures exist for the most abundant factors to move to countries with greater scarcity, where they can command a better return. For instance, if permitted, many in the labor pool where workers are unemployed or poorly paid go to countries that have full employment and higher wages. So these people, right, receive higher wages not only because of the greater scarcity, but also because more capital-rich countries have invested in machinery and infrastructure that make the imported laborers more productive than in their home countries. United States, Western European economies, right? They have abundant, they are capital-rich countries, but they are not abundant in cheap labor. They are mostly abundant in capital. Therefore, by allowing those workers to work here in the United States and obtain full employment and higher wages, those countries, capital-rich countries, can make the imported laborers more productive than in their home countries. Okay? And there's also the issue of complementarity. Factor mobility through foreign investment often stimulates trade because of the need for components, right? The parent company's ability to sell complementary products and the need for equipment for subsidies, right? So, in other words, immigration enhances trade by creating these ethnic enclaves of networks that link immigrants with their native countries. Okay? So the enclaves serve as niche markets for imports from their native countries. For instance, so you look at the United States, and you look at the most recent U.S. soy sauce imports, right? If you look at most of the U.S. soy sauce imports, they are mainly sold to Asian Americans. They may be sold to Americans who are interested in Asian cuisine, but most predominantly they're sold mainly, those soy sauce imports, they're sold mainly to Asian Americans. Okay? So among all the theories, as you can appreciate, the factor mobility theory is indeed the most dynamic theory that sort of tries to link the foreign trade with international and domestic factor mobility. Okay, in this chapter, we basically discuss different trade theories, starting with the interventionist theories and continuing our discussion with free trade theories of absolute advantage and the comparative advantage. And then we discuss other theories that answer different questions, such as the product life cycle theory, the national diamond theory of national competitiveness. And we ended the discussion with the international factor mobility theory. Thanks for listening to my lecture so far, and hopefully next week we will continue our discussion with part 1 of chapter 7. Part 1 of chapter 7. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.